So what's a quick, yes, sir?
I've spent some time in conflict zones, and I was wondering if you could talk about how war and the breakdown of government
Yeah.
affects slavery.
Absolutely. That's a great question. One of the things, I'm going to digress very slightly and say as a scholar, one of the things that's exciting about working in this space is that it's wide open. There are so many things we don't know. And one example of that I'm actually working on at the moment is what will be the very first book about the relationship between conflict and slavery. Even though we know that if you go back to prehistory, I mean, we know this from archaeological prehistoric remains that slavery and conflict were very tightly linked together. And then the very first written records of human existence, the Sumerian cuneiform records, are about 15 to 30% about going up into the hills above Mesopotamia and raiding to take mountain people into slavery to bring back down to the Sumerian, to support the Sumerian economy. And there's never really been a day in human history where you don't have slavery and conflict really tightly linked together. Even to the point that we don't think of so much, but remember that while there may have been 6 million people killed in the Holocaust by the Germans, there were 10 million people enslaved by the Nazis. And you know how they do. The Nazis kept such great records, right, that we know that very precisely. And in fact, where I live on the island of Guernsey off the coast of the United Kingdom, which was one of the only parts of Great Britain to be occupied by Germans, there were some 10,000 slave laborers there between 1940 and 1945. 10,000 on a little island. And many of them were worked to death and starved to death. So the point is, you're precisely right. When conflict breaks out, the rule of law collapses. When the rule of law collapses, people are not protected by the rule of law. Conflict itself then creates refugees. It removes the ability to reach food, shelter. You have situations like Eastern Congo, which is particularly horrific where I've done work. And you know, you can hardly generate a more powerful route into almost immediate slavery than having a conflict break out. One of the things I've been working on very hard lately, just to be slightly nerdy with you about this, is I've also been trying to understand how slavery has been used as a strategy within conflicts, where people actually start with strategic aims in conflict, that one of their strategic aims is to enslave others, or rarely, like in the United States, one side was to remove slavery. But also how slavery operates as a tactic within war. And it does. There are many ways that you can point to today in which you can see how slavery is used as a tactic. We're now actually building databases about, starting just with the 260-some conflicts that have occurred since the end of the Cold War, and listing each one as strategic or tactical enslavement or neither. Right? So it'll be 2 or 3 years, then you can get the book. Right? Yes, sir.
So suppose you go walking into a slavery accepting area, and you say, you know, those guys over there are under slavery, and I've got $20 in my pocket here. I'm going to go buy one of them. What would happen then?
Well, I have to tell you, we don't do that.
No, not you.
I know, but I mean, people and people who work in this space actively discourage that happening. Well, I think you've probably already figured out what happens if you buy someone out of slavery. You hand money to a slaveholder. That's nice for them. You haven't affected the system in which the enslavement has occurred. That means the slaveholder can just go find another person. And, you know, you've basically just contributed to a criminal economy in a way that's kind of bad, you know. I say it's like, you know, paying a burglar to get your television back, but I mean, it's not even television, it's a human being. And it wasn't necessarily your human being in the first place, they were their own human being. And, you know, there was, you know, 20 years ago, there were some very well-meaning people who were very interested in what they called redemption. And particularly in Sudan, they were buying people out of slavery. And it didn't turn out well, you know. It didn't turn out well in a lot of different ways. Which is not to say it didn't help a handful of people, but it wasn't the way to go. It wasn't the way to bring it into slavery. So, Another question? Yes, yes, ma'am. You could address, sorry, she was saying the consumer consumption, that's kind of redundant, wasn't it? But anyway, the consumption that we all contribute to is important both in ecological damage and in environmental damage and in the slavery. And could you address both of them without addressing the consumer side of it? The simple answer to that is yes, you could, but it wouldn't be as effective, right? So you could, and if you could go to the ground level where the slavery is actually occurring, and if you had sufficient means and law enforcement and all kinds of stuff, yeah, you could stop, you could cut it off, nip it in the bud, cut it off at the source. But as long as the consumption was continuing, then the flow of money into a potentially criminal space would mean that other people would happily fill that space, even though you kept cutting it off. So it's important. The other thing, though, that's interesting to remember about this is that the total amount, that 150 billion, the total amount globally that goes in from our consumption directly into slavery is trivial. It's actually trivial. It's, in terms of the global economy, it's next to nothing. And if we were to yank the slavery out of the global economy miraculously overnight, the price of nothing would go up. Seriously. You wouldn't see any price rises. You wouldn't see any wages change. It's that trivial in the global economy. It's really a moral question that has to be brought to our consumption patterns. And that's where we then have to start thinking carefully about a moral watershed. Because a lot of times Americans, especially young Americans, they really seem to think that the cash register is a moral watershed, right? And I, as a young American, a pure mind and body, right? Things that I buy are good things because I buy them, and if a company on the other side of the cash register has sold me something that's tainted, they're making me a victim, right? And everybody else on the other side of the cash register is evil because they're part of this long chain of corporate greed or whatever it is, right? And that is just so wrong because no product chain exists without the person at the end of the chain on our side of the cash register, right? There are moral points where you can say these people at that end of the chain are criminals, guilty of criminal violations. And then there are people who are aiding and abetting that crime or receiving bad goods. And then other people who are whitewashing. And it actually crosses out of criminality, legal criminality, but into very intense culpability. And then into very high levels of responsibility if they know what they might be dealing with and how they're passing it on to the chain. But there you then reach points where companies who have that flowing into their chain, but they can't figure out how exactly it gets in there, take responsibility and are responsible because they make cell phones or they make whatever. But once, that responsibility just continues all the way down to us. And we're not as desperately responsible as Apple or the people who made our wedding rings or whatever, but we still have responsibility because we're the ultimate driver of the whole machine. Without us, the machine wouldn't turn because we're the ones who put the money in the end.
Last question.
Oh, last question, and then, yes, ma'am.
How do you suggest that we encourage people to only support companies that are certified fair trade?
Right. So her question was, how would I suggest we get people to support companies that are certified and only support the ones who are certified fair trade? Well, for starters, there's a good answer to this and a less good answer, right? The good answer is fair trade is good. It works. We know that it works. It's now much more pervasive than it used to be, where there's an organization which is checking the supply chain. Likewise, a lot of organic inspection pretty much takes care of the labor side of it as well. That's the good news. The not so good news is that if all we ever had was fair trade chocolate at the moment, we'd get like 2 Hershey's Kisses a year each, maybe, right? So we can't just do it through the system of fair trade, though I absolutely support that all the time, and people should do, because the more people use it, the better it gets, the more it spreads, and it helps to push the big companies in the same direction. So absolutely so.